Hey folks, welcome to the next, should I call it even a podcast? I think it's not even a webinar is not the proper way, but nevertheless, however we call it, the most important is that we have today a special guest, Tomasz Ducin. I'm really happy that Tomek, because Tomasz is Tomek in short in Polish, agreed to join because Tomek is one of the best person to talk about the front-end architecture, at least of those that I know and I'm following. So today we will be talking about the front-end architecture and architecture in general. We will try to cover all those differences or maybe why we have those differences between front-end and back-end. And Tomek, would you like to add something more about yourself for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much, Oscar, for letting me be your guest because I really like this. This could sound a little cringe, but I also follow what you're posting and what you're creating, and I really like. Yeah, I admire all the creations, all the stuff that you write and that you publish. So yeah, it's my pleasure to be your guest. Yeah, so just a quick intro. So I've been working mainly in big products in industries such as finances, banking, real-time data analytics. That would be it. I used to be a developer, team lead, architect, and so on and so forth. And something like 8 years ago, I started my consultant's journey as an independent one. So what I do right now is basically helping other teams or products to overcome obstacles related to performance testing, architecture. Like some people are considering whether to go into micro frontends or not, or they expected something to happen after the transition, but it didn't happen. And this is where I come in. And apart from that, I do trainings related to yeah, frontend and architecture, just as you said.
Mhm. Yeah, so Tomasz also is doing the courses on Edhead.io, and also he has not so active recently because of child, I think, but really a nice YouTube channel on the front end and TypeScript. I learned also a lot from that, so I also encourage you to check that. I will add links under the video, so if you're watching that, then you already have it right there. Um, one of the triggers for our discussion was your recent article about what is front-end architecture, and front-end was with the brackets. And when I read it for the first time, then that sounded to me a bit like a rage rage post. Was it like that?
Um, Well, our current talk right now is triggered by the article, and the article was also triggered by yet another conversation that sparked from, I'm not sure whether it was during a training or some convo on social media, but yet another person, yet another time wrote that basically directory structures and file directories, etc is basically boils down to front-end architecture. And basically, my head's, was just overflowed with blood. So I just, they say that if you need to repeat something 3 times at least, then you should write about it. And this is something that I used to repeat, I don't know, maybe even 50 times. So I decided, yes, this is finally the moment to challenge that misunderstanding, misbelief. I don't know how to call
Mhm.
it. I believe that it's very difficult, like it's very challenging for me not to do too many generalizations, but I think that quite too many front-end developers, front-end engineers have quite vague understanding of what architecture is all about. So the two main challenges or obstacles, I would even say, is over focusing on the tools and over focusing on the things that you can immediately see from either the code or the files or their structure or whatever. And what architecture is all about is about the things that are not that easy to see just from a very quick look, very quick glance. So I kind of challenged this. Well, not only the directory structure, because this is quite easy to challenge, but I also gave kind of, I don't know, handful, dozen of
Mm-hmm.
examples. Like there sometimes when you make a decision, an architectural decision, you can look at it from different perspectives, and that what really matters in considering application or system architecture is the characteristics that you give or limitations that you bring, the opportunities that you introduce, and not exactly the tool, the convention, or the structure that you pick, because this is quite often something that has little relevance, and the characteristics that you bring or that you reduce, or even you close the doors that something becomes impossible. This is what matters in the long run, and this is way more difficult to reason about in the long run. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what I like about the article, but it was also a hard for me a bit because actually my understanding of this article was that it was explaining what is architecture in general. So it was really focused on this decision making and which decision could be considered important. Of course, that's a hard thing to decide. But and it was nice that you had those examples like choosing to implement front ends, micro front ends or not, or whether that this is like a significant decision, but whether which tools, so for instance, Webpack Module Federation or some native stuff or whatever, is not so important to be considered architecture. So the hard part for me was that actually understand why are we even calling that a front end architecture then? So what are your thoughts on that? Why do we have this distinction between
Yeah, front end.
architecture and front end architecture?
Yeah, so well, people could have different take on this. I believe that architecture is mainly about as you said, the decision making, the trade-offs, and the impact and the consequences, and the things that are difficult to change in the long run, etc., etc. So we have a handful of these definitions, and um, well, people can have different takes. My understanding is that somehow front-end development and back-end development kind of divided into two tribes that are living in their own bubbles,
Mm,
and yeah, there is too little of knowledge sharing and experience sharing between the two groups. And what I also found out is that at least the people whom I had pleasure to work with do not read enough books when it comes to basically the classics. The things
mhm,
that we are discussing in engineering landscape and industry have all been carefully, thought out, written down in books, analyzed, etc. They just have different platforms. So, uh, for instance, all the messaging solutions, etc. This has all been already described. What changed is basically the scale of the applications and that we have cloud. So this
mhm,
didn't exist 20 or 40 years ago, but the patterns are the same. And what is kind of both funny and kind of sad at the same time is that we in the front end world tend to kind of rediscover some patterns, or maybe to some extent reinvent the wheel. But also, what makes it slightly more difficult is that, well, the front end is first and foremost an interface, and it has a totally different range of responsibilities. So there is hardly any persistence, or in vast majority of the cases, there should be no considering of persistence.
mhm,
I'm on the side that there should be as little domain logic as possible. So there are topics that are absolutely relevant, such as bounded context on front end, but things like aggregates or entities, etc. Like this has very, like, generally tactical DDD, has very little to do with frontend. And kind of frontend has specific responsibility. For instance, we care about the user interactions. So different patterns and different, let's say, issues arise. Different patterns make sense to be used. For instance, in frontend, something that is very highly appropriate is a state machine, which is kind of not the first thing that you would implement on the backend side, and on the client side, this is like one of the first things that you should
Mhm.
take into consideration. Or if we think about state management, and we take the most radical and the most useful tool, which is Redux. This is a very good example because Redux is very radical in
Mhm.
in its philosophy. For instance, there are no events and there are no commands, there are actions, which I think is kind of a symbolic way to show that there is a difference in the way you think about systems, because
Yep.
there is no event command query separation of logic, and how do systems integrate and communicate with each other. And there is basically an action. And it is true that trying to define whether Redux actions are more events or commands is basically boils down to a theoretical discussion, because this is difficult to both distinguish whether this is past time or whether this is the future time. But we can clearly see that whenever you dispatch an action, that you do care what is the consequence of it. So you could say, oh, this is more like a command. But on the other hand, the user has clicked something, so the past tense, and like this is this is somehow different because this is only the interface. So yeah,
Mhm.
this changes a lot.
Yeah, I think that, regarding the Redux, so the side note is that I'm calling that command sourcing because it's more like for the specific sets of actions or commands, whatever we call it, it's assumed that we will always get the same result because in theory, as you said, there is no storage. So we are just going through this state machine, which should always give us the same result. So yeah, so I think that that's an intriguing use case of showing those similarities and differences. I think that for many of the like people that are focused on backend work, this state management and the plenty of different state management techniques is one of the most surprising and the hardest to grasp parts. So coming back for a moment for this distinction and this connection between front end and a back end, I'm always saying for that this is one of the worst cases that many of our so-called best practices are created by the backend developers because then somehow those front-end stuff is just pushed outside like yeah, that's not important. uh, in general it would be best if there was no front end, if we could just make it just static and call it a day. However, I don't think that nowadays this is even possible. This even makes any sense. I think that uh, those two camps, so front end and back end, could learn a bit from each other. So, do you agree with that, or maybe if you do, then do you have some examples of what one and the other side could learn from each other if they were working closer?
This makes perfect sense what you're saying. So, just a small side note before I get to your question is that quite often, at least in my bubble, I can see memes which basically say that frontend is more complex or difficult than backend, or that backend is more difficult than frontend. Which, well, I believe that. we as software engineers should consider ourselves as problem solvers if we
Mm-hmm.
try to think about, well, understanding the problem first and then trying to pick the correct solution. Then the whole distinction between front-end and back-end architectures and all the concerns that we take into our account, they become very similar to each other. And what happens is that we have the same set of physical forces. We need to understand basically the same principles, and not only like, kind of either obvious or very, very, very basic things like solid, but also, like what are the pros and cons of sharing? Like
Mm-hmm.
sharing data, sharing models,
Yeah.
sharing infrastructure, sharing everything. The pros and cons are basically exactly the same. And we just need to apply it to whatever the code or product or system we're working on. And this doesn't seem to be that difficult. What I found is that if you are an experienced front-end dev, then you know how much you had to learn. So you consider that, oh, the other side that you might be ignorant about or very, very little experienced does not have such level of difficulty because you are uh, unaware of your inconfidence. Like this is an unknown for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the same on the other side, that if you're an experienced backend developer and you don't know what is the complexity that front-end developers need to work with all the time, then you think, oh, the other side, which I'm ignorant about, is the easier one because my is so difficult because I have to put so much effort into it. And so I would say this is basically the competence incompetence model, being aware or unaware. I would say that backend is more difficult than frontend for me only because I feel more experienced in frontend
Mm-hmm.
and I know how much on the backend side I don't know yet, and this is also one of my area of very very focused interest. Well, what front-end developers could learn from backend? Oh, there is so much that I could that we could spend hours on listing it. But generally, if you consider what are the architectural styles and what are the pros and cons behind them, and you walk into the problems that they want to solve and the problems they unintentionally introduce, and you will see all the patterns that are there, then you don't only learn the patterns, the styles, the paradigms, the mind shift, etc., but you will also learn a totally new way of thinking about the traits that you want to introduce, the price you have to pay, which is not very common in front end. As you've said, there is like for each framework, and as they say, there is each week there is a new JavaScript framework out there, which is not as bad as it used to be a decade ago, but still there are lots and lots of new tools. So what I would say is a challenge on front end is that we tend to micro optimize stuff. We tend to
Mm-hmm.
think about the API itself. So basically, what is the abstraction that you use on your API level? But what is not really considered in details enough is how do you use the tool and what is the shape, what is the workflow, what is the structure of what you're building. And by structure, of course, I don't mean
Mm-hmm.
the code and the files, etc., but the relations between the modules, the relations between whatever teams are working on the product. For instance, something that is very, very classical is that when I do consultancy,
Mm-hmm.
when I take a look at a system, it turns out that whether a backend is monolithic or microservice based, never mind, we can clearly see more or less that, yeah, multiple teams are working on a code base that is highly modular because each team could have a separate
Mm-hmm.
product owner with separate priorities, so essentially a separate bounded context, etc., etc. And what front-end folks have on their side is basically a directory separate by an entity.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine e-commerce, and then you have a whole module for a product, and they call it modular. yeah, this the silence here should
Yeah.
should sound quite a lot. So there is a whole lot of things to learn for front-end devs to learn from back-end devs, not only when it comes to patterns and even
Mm-hmm.
architectural styles, but even a whole way of thinking. So, as I said, not necessarily tactical DDD, but strategical DDD
Mm-hmm.
is something that you don't necessarily like you don't apply it on front end separately because it doesn't make sense in
Yeah.
separation, but at least to know what is the whole point of ubiquitous language and the semantics of domain within your system, then you start to think in a completely different way. Like most front-end senior front-end engineers know that a god class is your enemy, yet they separate their modules basing on what an entity is.
Yeah.
So like, it's kind of detached.
Yeah. From my experience, when in my teams, it was really hard to persuade, front-end developers to think, as you mentioned, think about the business domain. So if you're building component, then what's actually this component is all about. And instead of, just naming the operation based on what's happening, so, something was selected, but actually what is the business intention behind it. And of course, on the backend side, that's also focus on technicalities that's also existing, but definitely there is much more discussion on how to reflect. So all this DDD or in general deploying the domain into your
Hmm.
code.
Hmm.
However, on the on the bright side, like I personally learned a lot when I was working for a few years in Angular, the new Angular. I was an extreme
Hmm.
hater of the old one. The new one is actually okay. And I learned a lot. I realized because in Angular you have this style that you have component wherever it is, but inside the component you have everything that is related to each other. So you have unit tests, you have the view, you have the backing JavaScript or TypeScript code. And when I spent time with Angular, uh, having this background as a mostly backend developer for a long time, it made me realize that actually that's a really ergonomic approach. So because I'm keeping all the things that are changing together in one place. So I think that that's one of the examples of how front end and back end team could get a good synergy. And I think I agree with what you said. I think that front end developers are really good on the tactical side of making things like there's practices like functional. If you ask them, then they will explain you all those, especially if they worked in React a lot, then all those weird functional style naming, etc. They are really skilled on that. But yeah, this connecting the dots, that's not always there. It's not that they are not capable, but as you said, the disconnection, and maybe because that was somehow always gathered by the backend team that that's what we have to do. You do your own stuff. I don't know.
Hmm.
What do you think
Yeah,
about
there is so much you have touched. I'll
yeah,
try to.
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, first of all, I would say that whichever framework you choose, like the modern ones or at least the mainstream ones, will basically have the same approach that a component, a front visual component, front end component, whatever we call it. Certainly, what a component is on backend side is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're using the same term, which makes it even more difficult to communicate. So a front-end component is going to look similar, like it has the its visual layer, it has its potentially its state, it has its behavior, it has its tests. Also, it has something that I cannot think of any equivalent in backend. Maybe you know Storybook, basically a catalog of
Yes.
visual
Yeah.
components that you have. This is like what you've said that front-end devs are very good at tactical aspect. Absolutely. Like you walk into a project, And even if you have, let's say, 1,000 or 5,000 components, but only 50 of them are really important,
Hmm.
and basically all like, or let's say domain agnostic, highly meant to be reusable,
Yeah.
and all the others are basically specific one time usage, etc., then you can in a very cheap way basically catalog them as products in the IKEA store or whatever.
Hmm.
And you do it basically in minutes, like
Yeah.
essentially in minutes. You generate all the stuff, and you can see, for instance, the way that we could communicate with both business and the marketing, the accounts, and etc. is basically these are the components that we have. If you need anything, then we are going to work bottom up, which is very, very cool, because we're going to work on the components in isolation, as you've said, with all the tests, etc. Then we can easily provide the things, basically additionally creating an always alive documentation.
Hmm.
We can also create integration tests using Storybook itself. Which is like really, really good
Yeah.
when it comes to tags. So yeah, I would
I
also, yeah.
sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting. Just I think that for backend people, I think archetypes could be something similar. So you are building like a archetypes, like an archetype book of archetypes. So like this is
Mhm.
my, let's say, even they might be small, but they might be also like a shopping cart archetype, and joined together that you can reuse in multiple places potentially.
But is it something like a service or a model or
No,
a...
I I don't. I mean, it's not so popular, unfortunately, in backend, but definitely like there were for us for some period there was like a model-based development called or model-based design where you had those in theory those popular archetypes like reservation, etc.
Okay.
And you could
Inventory,
if you yeah if you knew it then you could like build okay those this is my let's say reservation
domain.
or I'm using here like a reservation style or reservation archetype and make that easier to grasp, but definitely it's not that I would say uh, mm,
Not that visual.
not that visual and not that explicit like
Yeah. So what you mean is basically the archetypes of a domain model or the
yeah.
domain complexity. Yeah. So this is very high level. Yeah, and yeah, you can put in Storybook or whatever alternative, basically the very low level thing. So the equivalent I could think of would be if you have, I don't know, either entities or value objects or
Hmm.
aggregates, and you
Yeah.
could basically create some way of a catalog of how you use
Yes.
them, which is super cool if, let's say, if you want to have a newcomer to your project and you want them to become highly productive on day one. So basically, they first of all take a look at what your components are. By the way, you also see from Storybook how do you group them. So depending on your company's scale and the complexity of the domain, you could see basically where there might be some business-related modules. So maybe there is already some Conway's law that you
Hmm.
can see there. You also see what is the, let's say, approach, how much technical, how much domain-related it is, etc. But what is going back to your previous question? What could front-end developers learn from back? What could back-end developers learn from front-end? This is essentially not sure if you said that this way is to no, I will rephrase it. To get things done slightly faster, slightly cheaper,
Hmm.
and yet not to do it in a lousy, poor man's approach, but just don't overdo it. For instance,
Yeah.
due to how Java, .NET, and many other platforms were built, when you want services to communicate with each other, of course, when you are distributed, then you need to create, DTO that would need to be serialized. Then you need to deserialize it. You need to, if you have, a whole tree of objects, object that are related to each other, then you would need to have a factory or an even abstract factory, etc. Blah 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 blah. And And yeah, this is essentially how you do these things because sometimes at least, not only because this is like you always have been doing it, but basically you need to put this code somewhere. And if you don't like in software design, if we don't think upfront where should some logic live, then it will basically leak wherever it can leak. So this is why we have all these, classical design patterns that people make fun of on the front end side. And what is very productive is that on the front end side, I know it's easier, but since we have browsers and browsers are capable of parsing JSON very efficiently, then what we care about only is basically that we have a TypeScript interface. Now, it depends whether we trust our server side and we don't need to do any type of runtime type checking, or if we don't trust it 100% and we want to introduce runtime type checking. This is something that I just leave aside. But basically, the thing that we need is the interface that could be even automatically generated from a contract like Swagger, Pact, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
solution we're using, and that's it. Like that's all you need. So we can prototype way faster. We can implement stuff way faster using this bottom-up approach based on Storybook or any alternatives. We can deliver solutions way faster, and certainly we are not using. Well, I would say we are using the very same classical design patterns, but not sure if you agree on that. I would say that the awareness of the names of the patterns are not the same big, but basically, in the long run, the intuition leads us to the very same places. So, for instance, in backend, you could have a interface that you implement with multiple classes that have a factory in their name or a strategy in their name, a policy in their name, etc. And on frontend, what we know that we should write is that basically this is a function. Now, I know it's a strategy or a policy or a factory, whatever, but I don't call it strategy, policy, or whatever because this is essentially a function. So we get what is the abstraction, but we just don't care about the interfaces. Moreover,
Mm-hmm.
if we have just a TypeScript function signature, by function signature, I mean the type, not the implementation. And we know that there could be multiple function implementations of the same type, then this is essentially the design pattern, whether I am aware of the name or not, but it often reduces a vast amount of code that does nothing. For instance, maybe I'm going to be a slightly nitpicky, but I've seen like huge amount of code bases on the backend side where there is a single interface with a single implementation, and their names is basically one-to-one, which is kind of, doing
Yeah.
all object-oriented for the sake of object-oriented. Or especially in .NET, where you have, let's say, iProduct implemented by product. So
Mm-hmm.
what is the whole point? Like, I know, yeah, the dependency inversion principle, yada yada, but what is the whole point of extracting the interface if you're always going to use the only implementation and like strictly, literally, you are following dependency inversion, but I think you are losing the whole point of what is going on there. So on front end, I would say we're not trying to overdo these things. So there is way less kind of dead abstractions,
Mm-hmm.
zombie abstractions.
Yeah, yeah. So I agree regarding the the awareness of the naming in the front end, which I in general consider as a positive ignorance. I hope that no one will be uh, somehow feeling bad about what I said. I mean, it's positive because, as you said, if it's some sort of ignorance and if you are focusing on what's that actually doing, but not why it's actually named like that, then you are more focused on the outcome instead of using the specific pattern. Of course, that's not always good things. It's good to know the theory, but Yeah, that's also the reason why I'm doing in recent years more and more TypeScript, etc., because I'm also feeling a bit more productive. But of course, that's a highly personal and subjective thing.
And
So,
simplified, I guess,
yes,
because there
yeah.
are lots of nuances that we
Mhm.
don't have time to cover.
Yeah. So, coming back to our initial discussion about the important decision and the so-called front-end architecture. So I think that we know that uh, we have in general architecture and some already differences, but my guess, I don't have exact numbers, but my guess that most of the readers and viewers are probably more on the backend side. So if you could try to show like what are the significant front-end architecture decision that you are usually doing when you are either setting up or evaluating some existing projects. So what are your personal, like, top few important information, not necessarily decision, but decision information about the project and its architecture when you
The
start.
concerns
Mm-hmm,
to consider. It depends, of course, from which perspective we are looking at. So one of the perspectives could be how do we deploy stuff? So how many teams, how many developers are working on something? So whether a micro frontends would make any sense or not. What is the frequency of deployment? For instance, if you have a, let's say, very dynamic business that is working with the end user who could be, the just anybody, then we would need to think about, the infrastructure that considers being able to, ship quite often and roll back easily. So for this reason, we would need to think about, all the observability monitoring stuff, and basically something that front end developers overlook very often is basically the whole DevOps culture,
mm-hmm,
because quite too many front-end folks whom I know think that DevOps is basically Kubernetes, or I don't know, Docker or whatever. So no, it's not. And going to more logical perspective, how do you separate modules? So if there would be, well, basically, if you have one team of, I don't know, a few people that deploy every end of sprint or whatever, or even less frequently, then it doesn't make a big difference in which direction you go, as long as these characteristics don't change, because, well, you can even divide your logic by entities. And, well, this is not going to be useful if you grow in complexity or in the size of your development team. But as long as basically 5 people were working on something, and still 5 people are going to work on the very same thing, even if these are different people after 5 years, then like you can cope with it. So again, I would say also, what is the scale of the system? Because from my experience, backend team, like the number of backend developers are usually bigger than front developers, because they have some more responsibility when it comes to, persistence,
mm-hmm,
keeping the consistency, transactions, communication, internally within the backend. So not to say that frontend is easier, but there is a lot of topics that we don't need to think about on frontend. So basically, there is slightly more work to be done there. But still, if our front-end application is more challenging, then basically what you share and how do you share it is very, very important. So, what are the models that you share? What is the state that you share? If you share the state, then I tend to ask questions. Okay, so what if we want to divide something or split something, or something changes? If we, let's say, have like something that I see very, very often in frontend is a canonical model, that basically an entity interface is being shared across pretty much the whole application.
mm-hmm.
So a quick question like, what if there is yet another function or a feature added to the system? Would you basically make the interface grow more and more and more? Um, Again, if we choose a state management solution, like quite often, the state management solution doesn't enforce any architectural traits, but sometimes it does. For instance, again, Redux. So Redux enforces a centralized state solution. And I would say this is the biggest downside of Redux, because if you are using something which is centralized and most of the advantages like they shine as long as Redux is the only source of truth actually in
Mm-hmm.
your application. So you can break the rule, you can introduce a competition to Redux, but then this isn't the only source of truth within your application. So the advantages stop to shine that much, or they even become a false advantage. So you are left only with the costs. So these are the things. Or for instance, as you've said, like yeah, some people say that Redux is kind of a poor man's even sourcing on frontend. But I like your name that this is command sourcing very much, because this is yeah. I believe that the action is more a command than event, but yeah, it doesn't really matter on frontend that much. So how many things do you share? And also regarding the fact that frontend is visual, what taxonomy do you introduce into your project when it comes to how do we divide our code base? So where do you put the line of what do you want to reuse? Which
Mm-hmm.
components are going to be reused? And there is also, I'm not sure what is the, let's say, state of mind on the backend side, but on frontend, there is too much reusability obsession, way too much. So
Same on backend.
same on backend. So like a counter force to dry, don't repeat yourself. Something that I like to speak about quite often recently is the wet, write everything
Mhm.
twice, which is not twice literally, but like try to make something reusable once you see that these things are reusable. And basically, this is quite obvious that if you have a design language like how your application looks and feels, then you would have highly reusable things that are totally module agnostic and domain agnostic, such as, you know, buttons, radio buttons, checkboxes, etc. But for instance, if you want to consider a data table or a listing or a grid table that you need to implement with things like you know, advanced sorting, advanced filtering, advanced pagination, would you rather create one thing that is highly reusable, and the more parameterized it is, the more reusable something is, the less usable the thing becomes, right? Because it's basically too abstracted away.
Mhm.
Or would you create multiple specific versions that are simpler? Where would you say that, like, where is the boundary of the thing that is reusable? How much, you know, flexible, how much generic should it be? Like, where do you put the boundary? And another thing, very common in frontend is sooner or later, a company would like to have a common look and feel, and there would be a need to introduce a component library, library of reusable components. Who is going to maintain it, and what is going to be the workflow? Like in bounded context terminology, like the library is going to be the supplier, and the domain modules are going to be customers. But so we see who asks somebody to do the stuff, but actually, if we basically spark a new team that is going to maintain the component library, um, like how much other teams can basically tell them what to do,
Mhm.
because this is basically an organizational single point of failure. Would we create a separate team, or maybe we will not create a team but distribute the responsibility? How big the component library should be? How much? Well, we know it shouldn't be domain agnostic, but how many parameters should it include? So quite often let's say, how do you like summarizing the thing? How do you deploy and monitor the application is one thing. How do you share the state, share the model would be another thing. And how do you work with reusable components, usually the component library? These are the three, I would say, most critical pieces that are not um, thought well enough. And most of the issues come from these three, from my experience.
Yeah, it's it, sorry, it's really intriguing that in theory you were saying a lot of, specific front-end related stuff like UI components, like state management, etc. But in general, it just showed how similar are those issues that we have in front-end and on back-end side, because like the component, it's really similar to how the core team, like the best team in backend, or nowadays called platform team, uh,
Yes.
rebranded is called. Or for instance, I even had the case like you mentioned with this component library, internal component. In one of my project, there was a decision to form for some period a dedicated team for that, and that we will build our own component library from scratch. And I said, like, okay, but you will see that we will throw it away within a few months, because I knew that this is never gonna be going outside of our project, and this in the long term it won't be ever a priority. And unfortunately, I wasn't wrong here, because indeed at some point the team wasn't able to catch up because of the reasons you mentioned, like how to discuss about it between teams, etc. So yeah, it's really intriguing that people believe that there is a front end and back end architecture, and indeed the specific challenges are a bit different, but in general, the scale and the topics are really close to each other.
Yeah, they're absolutely very similar. And actually, the misconceptions are also very similar. For
Hmm.
instance, there was the famous case of Amazon Prime streaming that went back from microservices into monolithic style, and some part of the cloud or backend community said like, "Oh, microservices suck." And we have exactly the same, let's say, attitude or state of mind, considering some part of the front end folks that say that micro front ends are entirely wrong. This is a purely technical debt, and basically, totally ignoring Conway's law and how basically business work. Because some people just forget that we, the development part, we are the cost. We are
Yeah,
not the value itself. We are not the goal itself. We are the value, but we are not the goal itself. We are the cost. And basically, yeah, we are supposed to fix some problems, and we are not going to determine what the organization is going to be. We are basically meant to fix some problems. And yeah, the same way people consider that micro frontends are entirely wrong. And just a disclaimer, I'm neither a fan or anti-fan of micro frontends. To be honest, most often I discourage teams from doing this because I see that, like, similar with microservices, some costs and issues are guaranteed, obviously. And the benefits are, if the benefits are not clear, and quite often the benefits are not clear in certain cases, then I discourage the teams from going in a very, very, let's say, expensive and overcomplicated direction. And I think this is the right way to do. But yeah, like, I think this, like, considering microservices or micro frontends, like, of course there are differences, but at a very high level, the reasoning is yet again quite similar. So yeah, lots of
yeah,
similarities.
yeah. And I agree that most surprising part for many people is that the decision between whether to go more monolithic way or more distributed, like micro frontends, micro services, is not about the technical details, but about the Conway law. So setting up the
Of
teams and
course.
how to not interrupt each other.
Of course. And yeah, if somebody says that this is a technical approach to solve the people problem, then, well, first, there is a famous quote, I don't recall the author, is that no matter what they tell you is always a people problem. But if
Yeah,
we take
I think Gerald Weinberg.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But if we take this to extreme, then, well, everything is a people problem, right? Because we are
Hmm.
people, and whatever we are discussing come from people's heads. So these are all our abstractions, right? We are not building metal, right? We are working on abstractions. So it's all, yeah, it's always a people problem. But on the other hand, yeah, if you ignore or if you try to fight Conway's law, then you are in a totally different dimension or
Yeah,
a different
it's like
galaxy.
it's
Yeah.
like you would try to fight with the gravity law.
Yeah. So yeah. This way you can think of it as a technical debt or an architecture that is always wrong. But I think this is basically a fundamental cognitive bias if you dislike an architecture. This
Hmm.
is like liking or disliking a way of solution. Like I always try to find a metaphor from real life whenever thinking about abstraction things. So whenever I discuss patterns, architectural patterns, etc., I try to think something from a real world. And discussing system architecture, I like to think of different ways. How do you build buildings, which is kind of quite natural to think of it. And for instance, in Poland, as you know, we used to have this architecture called the Wielka Płyta, the big
Yeah.
blocks, the communist era, where they were building lots of very big blocks of flats in a very cheap way, yet they did it very, very fast. The quality, how we perceive it nowadays, is like nothing interesting and
Hmm.
nothing that you would like to prefer. Maybe only the location could be attractive, but the quality of these flats are not really attractive. But when it was introduced, the country was very poor, and we didn't have a better technology. We didn't have the resources. We didn't have the people skilled enough. We didn't have the time because there were lots of people who basically didn't have where to live because it was basically after the World War. And now, if we consider what were the trade-offs, how the decision was made, the moment the decision was made to basically invest into this architecture of lots of blocks which are poor quality but they are very big and they lots of people can live there, just the trade-off is that the quality is bad, and that if you want to improve the quality, then you would need to spend quite a lot of money later. I think it was a very, like, although I am not a communist fan, I think at that time it was a very good idea because
Yeah.
all in all, lots of people needed to live there. And is it crappy? Yes, it's certainly crappy. It's totally crappy. And yeah, if you ever lived in such, architectural blocks of flats, then yeah, you know what I mean. Like, it's not a place I would like to live there, but it basically served its purpose. And it also shows how important is the whole concept of evolutionary architecture. At some point in time, you can have some priorities, and even though you are living in the very same place, like in the same product, the business environment could change so dramatically, so significantly that your architectural drivers change a lot. So, do I dislike the communist blocks? Yes. Do I despise the architecture? No, because it was basically kind of lifesaver for hundreds of thousands of people or even millions. They had a place to live just after the war. So again, if you dislike an architecture and you consider that microservices are entirely wrong, then I would say like we are not working in the same discipline, I guess. Because
Yes.
like there are trade-offs
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. That's a really a great way to phrase it, and I totally agree. I totally agree, especially that there are so many different changes and factors that can not only even on like only on front end, only on back end, but we even didn't touch any of those discussions like, API first or back end for front ends on GraphQL. So all that stuff, how teams like in general should and collaborate with each other through the contracts, the technologies, and how to streamline that. But yeah, I fully agree. So we are slowly getting closer and closer to our time that we initially discussed. And I wanted to ask you, because I think that many people are struggling with that and have really strong and different opinions. Do you think that we should be having front end and back end teams or more business vertical teams? I know that it's a trap question, but I'm sure that you have also your strong opinion on that.
Well, I have a kind of observations from empirical experience, backed up by some smart people who just abstracted these things away. Well, I would say this all starts from how you build your product, I would say. And again, trying to start with the solution without thinking what is the problem that you're trying to solve is, of course, the wrong direction. So, if you consider your the product that you're trying to build, and the product is something that you want to redeploy quite frequently, and deliver the value as soon as you can. So you want to have the time to market as short as possible. Then try to think like, what is the quickest way to achieve the goal? So if a product needs to be, or a piece of a product, a module, whatever, it needs to be delivered by both backend and frontend, and most often this is the case, even if there is more or less work on one of the sides, but quite often needs to be at least some part delivered on both of the sides. Then it basically means that there needs to be a communication between them. Now, the more distance there is between the pieces of your company, the more expensive the communication is going to be. So our state of art nowadays is that we try to reduce the communication cost. So if we basically create, of course, yeah, full stack teams, or I would even say DevOps teams. Not that I am a DevOps engineer, but basically I'm
Hmm.
working in like according to the DevOps culture, like end to end, from whatever is the schema of my database, going through all the backend stuff, front end stuff, until the things like deployment, monitoring, rollbacking, full, measuring how the DORA metrics, how often do we, release, how long time it takes us to roll back a failure, how frequently the failures take place, etc. The closer the people are to achieve the very same goals, the simpler this is going to be. So I believe there are situations where doing the opposite could be helpful for some reason. And the thing that I observe quite often is that due to technical reasons, mobile teams tend to be separate, but I would say this is kind of a exception from the general rule. And the general rule would be that, like, of course, according to the size of your company, of your product, of your system, um, if you want to achieve something, put everybody that needs to achieve the goal together basically in one unit of our organization, and so that give them, like, empower them. I don't like this phrase, but give them all the credibility or the tools or the credentials that they need to achieve the goal, and basically let them do their job. So I would say, yeah, separate teams would be, I would consider it an exception
Hmm.
from a general rule that yeah, the cheaper the communication, the better. Because if the communication is something internal to a team, then we could consider it as a, like, of course it takes time, but no matter who you put into a team, there would be communication, either even if they are working on totally different things. So if you put people who build the same thing into into the same team, that we significantly reduce the cost of communication, which is going to be effective. And I would say this is the factor that reduces time to market. So again, like, look at the business first, look at your organization, not to fight with Conway's law,
Yeah, yeah,
essentially.
that's also my experience. I was in multiple teams working in a different way, so both technically split, layered split, and also vertically. And always those teams that were working together were the easiest and the fastest to deliver good quality. Because if you break the team with the technical layer, then you are telling them that, hey, this is your this is what you should be focused on. And I believe that teams should never focus on pure technology, but delivering the business value. Plus, for
Exactly.
me, it was always the most motivating if I could, and by I mean not only I on my own, but also as a team, deliver feature from end to end. It's super motivating if you can see that this is just what you did is someone is using that, and it's easier to make this empathy also.
Yeah, and well, just two things to add here. Even if we have, let's say, a team of, I don't know, three backend developers and one front-end developer, let's say, then even if it turns out that someone who is more skilled in Java or .NET would need to write TypeScript, and that would be slightly worse quality compared if
Hmm.
there was only, senior TypeScript folks writing whatever, then in the long run, it most often doesn't really matter because there is no, there is no kind of ideally elegant code or clean code,
Hmm.
whatever. I hate clean code, by the way, because this is basically a judgment, not a, objective characteristic that you can
Yeah.
measure in any way. And yeah, so even if a front-end developer will be given a simple backend task and it would be of a lesser quality or the other way around, this doesn't really matter because if the team is able to deliver as a whole, then this is what reduces the time to market. And going back to what we've discussed earlier, if we put a multidisciplinary skills people into single team, the probability of a knowledge exchange and basically taking a different perspectives at the well-known problems, the team is going to benefit from it significantly. For instance, front-end folks can show the back-end developers, as we said before, that there are more lightweight solutions to the things that they have been doing. On the other hand, backend developers can show front-end devs that, hey, like sharing the model across different front-end modules is probably not a good idea. So just introduce a mapper, just not to let the model leak. And this is something that front-end folks are, well, generally, from my observations, are not aware of. Because yeah, this is an entity, right? So let's put it there. A single source of truth everywhere. So yeah, I would say that a multidisciplinary team could make everyone benefit.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that's a good summary of our discussion and whether and kind of answer whether we have front-end and back-end architecture or the architecture. Um, so thank you, Tomek, for joining. And we already discussed behind the scenes that we are thinking with Tomek to maybe discuss in a bit more detail some specific parts of the front end part of the architecture. So if you have any ideas, feel free to share it and leave them in the comments. We are not setting any deadline for that, but I think that we'll try to cover some of those the most important pieces that we touched upon during this discussion. So thank you again, Tomek, for your
Uh,
time and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for letting me be here. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody who was listening. And yeah, hope to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.